other side of what makes up this program. And I believe Mary Ellen Miller is here. I think the New Jersey and Pittsburgh Erie, I believe, is here too. So, each year we give the Bridging the Gaps Award to someone whose activities promote social dialogue and construction interaction in an increasingly diverse world, span cultures and class to build collaboration and consensus, and encourage understanding through public service and civic involvement. This year, the Bridging the Gaps Award goes to David Sheff, whose book, Beautiful Boy, served as a central text for the Bridging the Gaps program. This book is an extremely powerful account of David Sheff's family living in the grip of addiction and experiencing the trauma of this disease as it took over the life of his beloved son, Nick. Our students and faculty all read the book and devoted time to discussing David Sheff's message within the context of their Bridging the Gaps experience. The relevance of Beautiful Boy to our program is far more than the fact that addiction is a health-related issue. The book also underscores the fact that as we listen to the stories of vulnerable and marginalized people and work within the community organizations that serve them, our perspective is altered, as is powerfully illustrated by the following quote from one of our 2014 interns who worked at an organization serving clients suffering with addiction. And I quote, "One of the most powerful comments a man told me was that he is still a person. He felt invisible as people would pass him in the streets, barely even looking at him. It was even worse when people looked at him, but instead of seeing a person, saw an animal and followed his instincts and urges instead of his intuition. As he sat across from me, he proclaimed that he was still human, and he longed for everyone to see that." She goes on to say, "What keeps clients returning to this community organization is the fact that the staff treats everyone like human beings. The staff does not judge, marginalize, or ignore. They spend hours listening, which a lot of times is all these men or women need." Interestingly, at one point in the book, Sheff also notes that Nick admitted that he sometimes wished that he had any other illness because no one would blame him. At the end of the book, David Sheff writes, "In addition to lowering morbidity and mortality, the war on cancer changed the way we look at the disease and treat its sufferers. Cancer is no longer the big C, the secret shame. Addiction, destigmatized, would come to be thought of as a terrible disease, best recognized and treated early. This might be the biggest breakthrough of all." He goes on to say that a war on addiction would dramatically reduce ED visits in prison populations, would eliminate homelessness, much homelessness, and dramatically reduce violence. And he ends by saying, "We'd help families stay together, repair broken neighborhoods, we'd alleviate immeasurable suffering." So what is David Sheff's message, and what does it have to do with Bridging the Gaps? We are a program that works with organizations who serve marginalized people, some of whom are addicted, but others who are marginalized for other reasons: homelessness, mental illness, poverty. David's clear and convincing message is that addiction is an illness and needs to be treated as such. I would argue parenthetically that poverty is also an illness of our society, and needs to be treated as such. Thus, in honoring David Sheff, we also honor our community partners who work with marginalized people day after day, in a world where their work is challenging and often under-resourced, where they persevere in spite of the inequities that surround them, with dedication and caring, to advocate for the well-being of the most vulnerable among us. In honoring David Sheff, we also honor the future of our Bridging the Gap students, hoping that they will use the privilege of their experience to advocate for the necessary changes to both remove judgment and marginalization from health-related settings, as well as to make quality care and hope possible for all, regardless of the type of illness or economic circumstance. And finally, in giving this award, we honor David Sheff himself, who is leveraging his personal experience to raise awareness about the reality of addiction and those it impacts. He has achieved great acclaim as a writer, but we honor him today for combining his profession and his personal journey to highlight the changes that are too long in coming for those who are marginalized and the families who love them as they live in the grip of addiction. David?
First of all, I want to just say how honored I am for the award and mostly, I guess, for being here. I now, as I'll talk about a little bit, is from the story of our family story, what I wrote about in Beautiful Boy. It launched me off into a complete new world, into a world of the suffering of addiction, and I've learned that, of course, addicts themselves are suffering, their families are suffering, their communities are suffering, and I travel around the country a lot and I meet people, and it can be really, really, really sad and really depressing. And so to be here, it's just remarkable to see what you're doing, to see what Bridging the Gap does, and it really makes me feel that there's hope. So thank you. Well, since it sounds like you were forced to read my book, I will very quickly sort of catch up from. First of all, I wrote a lot about my son, Nick, who was, as I wrote, he was this extraordinary child. I tell some stories, and of course there are many more about what kind of a kid he was as he was growing up. He was this unique, lovely person. Of course, his dad, so I'm prejudiced, but he was, and he had his very unique personality, which was emerging even when he was in kindergarten. I believe I tell in Beautiful Boy about the time there was a period of time when he would go to kindergarten only wearing tights with his underwear on the outside, and of course he was teased by other kids and said only girls wear tights. He said, Superman wears tights. And another time he was asked to write, the kids were all asked to write about themselves, whether they live in a house or apartment, and what their parents did, or if they lived with their parents, whatever it was. And Nick's, one of the questions they asked was, what color are you? And Nick responded that he was beige. He grew up, again, I told these stories, he grew up and he was just always this great kid, and he did all the things that parents, we look to our children, we look for barometers to tell us how they're doing, and according to those barometers, Nick was doing great. He was a good student, he was an athlete, he was on the water polo team, he was the captain of the swim team, and he worked on the student newspaper. And so he was not the kind of kid who I would have perceived, or his teachers would have perceived, or even the health counselors at his school would have perceived as someone who not only was using drugs, but who became addicted. And the reason I remind all of us about those stories about Nick when he was a child was because he did not look like an addict. I had this image, and I think many people have an image of what a drug addict looks like, and it is the person who we might see when we're walking down the street and is homeless and is in a doorway, and that's what an addict looks like. I never thought an addict looked like my son, and it did, and he became one. And the tragic thing that happens with this disease, I mean, anybody, and every disease is horrible, every serious illness, and we would never want someone that we love to become ill. But as Lucy as she explained, this is a disease like others. Certainly all mental illnesses fall into this category, but addiction may even be worse because it appears from the outside that addicts aren't ill. It appears from the outside that addicts are choosing to get high, and that's all they care about. They don't care about the impact on themselves, physically, on their families. We judge addicts harshly. They feel shame. They feel shame already even before they're judged because they are ill with a disease that causes behavior that they're not proud of. People tell me when I speak to them sometimes, people who don't get it, they say, this is not a disease because if you have cancer, you can't just wish it away. With addiction, all you have to do is stop using, stop getting high, stop drinking, whatever it is. But the fact is, as anyone who knows, who works with addicts has learned, if a person can stop using, they would. So Nick became addicted. His use escalated. Every time I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. He was using, by the time he was out of high school, he was not only smoking pot every single day, 3 or 4 times a day, drinking like mad. He'd started to use ecstasy and some other drugs, and then he started college at Berkeley. And within months of being there was the first time that actually finally I got a call from the UC, the University of California Security Department, to tell me that his roommates had reported that they hadn't seen him for maybe a week. And of course I thought he was in school, diligently beginning his college education. And what had happened at that point is that Nick says that he went to someone's house and they gave him a hit of what they said was speed, and he readily took it. He said he would have taken anything at that point. It was all about just getting high. But it turned out to be crystal methamphetamine, and he said that was the drug that he said it was it. He said it was interesting to hear because, again, people who think about addicts, we have this idea that it's about pleasure, and it's about sort of this narcissistic pursuit of pleasure and hedonism. But Nick says when he got high on crystal meth, it was for the first time ever. It wasn't about being high. He said it was the first time ever he felt this absence of anxiety inside himself. It corrected something. He said once, if only I'd been breastfed on this, I would have been okay. It also says something about mental illness in general. As I said, from the outside, it seemed like Nick was doing great through all those years. But then, only when he got older and when he got into serious trouble, was he able to even recognize the fact that all of his skills on the outside, all of his showing me and showing his teachers and showing all of us what we wanted to hear and what we wanted to see, it had no reflection of what was going on inside. He was in hell. He was in pain. He says that when he used drugs, the pain went away. First it went away a little bit with when he started smoking pot and drinking, and then they didn't work anymore, and so he continued his use, and it escalated. And then he tried meth, and all of a sudden it was just this revelation, and there was no going back at that point. That led to every other drug you could name. I mean, he was shooting heroin, and he had, all of us who are parents know well that our biggest fear is not knowing where our kids are. All we want as parents is we want our kids to be okay. We want them to be healthy. We feel like that's our job, is to raise them healthily. And the nightmare is a child out somewhere in the streets. We don't know where they are. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. My wife and I spent many, many, many nights up all night completely freaked out. I would get on the phone over and over again, calling the police to try to find out if they picked him up somewhere. Maybe there'd been an accident. I called hospital emergency rooms. I called the local sheriff so many times that one day, one of the calls at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning or wherever it was, he said, well, Mr. Sheff, have you tried the morgue? And I did. I called the morgue. The terror, the fear, the pain, it was overwhelming. We did our best to try to take care of our other kids. They say that addiction is a family disease, and at first I didn't get it. I thought, Nick was the one with the problem. He was the one who needed help. But really, very, very quickly, I realized that this was a disease that had infected our whole family. I wasn't able to function. Karen and I were barely able to take care of our younger children who suffered. And one of the things we realized is the addiction has collateral damage. It's not just the person who is addicted who becomes ill and who has increasing problems over the course of their life until they finally go into treatment. Jasper and Daisy, my little kid, the younger kids, Nick's little brother and sister, were very young when this all happened. And they grew up, and over the course of these years, their personalities changed. And both of them in very different ways, but they went from being these very sort of carefree kids to kids who were really, really struggling. And the reason is that to have this in a family was traumatizing. It was traumatizing to all of us and to little kids growing up. On one hand, they were terrified. They adored their big brother and were baffled. What was going on? How could he be doing this to us, to our family? So they were intensely worried about him. But the other piece of it is that they were traumatized because their parents were. The kids' parents, or whoever it is that takes care of them, we are their rock, their home. And their rock crumbled, their home was in complete disarray. So they were traumatized. And it happened over the course of years, and finally I was able to, at first I was in denial. I thought, well, Nick could just stop using. As I said, I was like everybody else, and he would stop using. And when it got extreme, I went to see counselors, I went to see therapists, and those school counselors, they told me, what I wanted to hear. No one said to me, no one explained to me what was really happening to Nick. No one had explained to me that he had this addiction, this disease called addiction. They said, Nick's going through a rite of passage, he's rebelling, maybe he's rebelling because you were so liberal, or because he didn't get enough attention, or because you had this terrible, terrible divorce when he was very young. And they reassured me, Nick's a great kid, he's going to be fine. But he wasn't fine, as I say, his drug use escalated, and not only did I make those phone calls in the middle of the night, but I got them too. The phone would ring, and there was this two emotions that would strike me. One of them was this sense of relief, because I thought that it would be Nick calling to tell me that he was okay, that he was alive. But the other terror was that phone call in the middle of the night that parents dread, which is the phone call that would tell us that our child didn't make it. And I never got that phone call, but I did get calls from hospital emergency rooms. One time a doctor calling to tell me that they had Nick. They were going to have to amputate his arm because it had become infected from shooting up. Another time a doctor called and said I should get down to the emergency room because they didn't think Nick was going to make it. But we were lucky, and Nick did make it. And with him in recovery, when he was doing better, and he'd been sober for a pretty long time at this point, a year and a half, 2 years almost, which seemed miraculous at that point, because this has been 10 years where he would finally get into treatment, we would finally get him into some sort of rehab, and he'd be doing great for a while. He would come home and he would relapse again. But Nick had been sober for a while, and as a journalist, I felt, sort of what I do is I write responsibility to tell the story of what had happened with the very strong message that this can happen to you too. You have to take it seriously, and if it does happen to you, pay attention very, very early. This is a disease, and like other progressive diseases, it gets worse over time. And the longer we ignore it, and the longer we deny it, the more it progresses. So I wrote an article that first it was in the Times Magazine, and then that led to Beautiful Boy. And when that book came out, it was a revelation to me, because both from the Times article and then from the book, I started to hear from people. You know, a couple people wrote, and a couple people called, and then I'd get emails, and I would get, and then more and more, and then it was, 100, then it was 200, then it was 500, and eventually thousands, and I still get letters every single day. And people tell me versions of, how did you get into our home? Your story, your family story is our family story. The details may be different, but we experienced what you experienced. And again, unique to this disease, someone was just telling me this, that their child, they had 2 kids, and one of their kids, their older child, had a form of cancer when he was a teenager. And when that happened, the community rallied. People brought them dinners every single night, and there was all kinds of support, and people were calling all the time. His second son, his younger son, became addicted and was on the streets for a while and ended up in jail, and there was no one bringing dinner. People didn't want to hear about it. They didn't want to talk about it. At first, he was reticent to talk about it himself because of this whole thing about shame and judgment. He felt he would be judged. I felt I would be judged as a parent. It must mean I was a terrible, terrible father that my son would become addicted. And also, I didn't want people to judge Nick harshly. And he felt that same way. And so people, I felt it was critical for people to hear, and people responded to the fact that here it was, this stranger had told their story. Finally, someone told their story, and they realized that they weren't alone. At that point, when Nick was in recovery, I felt that I told my story, and I was going to go back to my real life, the life that had preceded Nick becoming addicted. And I was writing a business book, and I was going to get back to it. But because of these people, because of this flood of people, and these people that I met, everywhere I went, I met people over and over again. I realized that I wasn't finished with, first of all, trying to understand addiction, and then moreover, trying to understand why we in our culture are so inept. First of all, even acknowledging that it exists, how pervasive it is, and second of all, helping people, and helping families when they become ill with this disease. So I put everything aside, and I spent really the last 10 years trying to understand this problem and trying to understand if we could do better. The first thing I did was I learned about the scope of the problem. I didn't have to understand at that point. I didn't have to learn about the personal toll addiction takes, because we experienced it in our family, and I heard about it from so many other families. Besides those letters and phone calls and all the messages I got from people who were telling me that I wrote their family story, I also heard about, over and over again, more than I can ever explain, ever express, over and over again from people who wrote a letter that began the same way. Your story is our story. Your child's story is my child's story, but our story had a different ending. And they said, the ending of our story is that my beautiful boy didn't make it. My lovely daughter didn't die. And I learned that we don't talk about this problem, but addiction is the number 3 killer in our country after heart disease and cancer. That overall 350 people die every single day And right now, because of the problem specifically with the use of prescription medication and the misuse of prescription medication, opiates mostly, one person, mostly children, are dying every 20 minutes. I also learned about the cost to society. Addiction costs us over $500 billion a year. Criminal justice costs and healthcare and lost productivity. It's responsible for most crime in America. Most people are incarcerated because of problems related to addiction, their own addiction, problems created, crimes committed when they were high. We're in the middle of a healthcare crisis, and in many emergency rooms in inner cities, about 75% or even more in some, people who walk through the door of the emergency room are there because of some problem related to drugs or alcohol. Addiction causes heart disease, stroke, liver disease, HIV, hepatitis, and not only these health conditions, but societal woes like poverty, abuse, suicide, neighborhoods defined by drugs and alcohol and violence, and nobody wants to talk about it. Patrick Kennedy, who was a congressman from Rhode Island, says that when he was in Congress, he would, because of his own personal experiences, his family has a history of addiction, of course, and he said that he continued to try to raise this issue as a healthcare issue on Capitol Hill, and he said all you had to do was mention the word addiction and you could clear a room. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody in the media wants to talk about it, unless it's a sensational story when someone dies, when a celebrity dies and overdoses. And again, it goes back to this, most people in this country don't want to talk about it because they feel that it is a disease that is about, it's a marginalized population and not a population that they're interested in. And then all of a sudden they want to talk about it when they're drugged, like I was. So I learned about the scope of the problem, and I also learned about, I don't want to talk too long, and I also learned that I guess if that's all I learned about how many people are dying and about how much suffering there is, then I would have been resigned to just mourn the fact of the loss of all these children and to just be so sad about the impact of addiction in our country and in our communities. But that isn't all I learned. What I learned is that addiction it's preventable and it's treatable, and yet we don't prevent addiction and we don't treat it. So in addition to that sadness because of all the people who are suffering, I began to feel this intense rage. We don't have to be losing the people that we're losing. And I learned that part of the reason that we are losing these people, the reason that we are causing that addiction is so prevalent. There are 23 million people in the country who are addicted. And if you add family members who are impacted, just immediate families, where over 100 million people are impacted by this disease. So the motivation to wrestle this problem into shape is huge. It's not only to prevent suffering, but it is to save all these healthcare costs and these costs in criminal justice and to make neighborhoods safer. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we need to do is to convince people, to educate people in our country so that they understand that addiction is a disease and it's not a choice, and it's not about people without willpower and not about people without morals. It's about people who are ill and very seriously ill. And the resistance to this idea is enormous. I didn't understand it until I started to look at the research. When people were asked to give buzzwords about what they think about addiction, it was all this stuff about weakness, and it was about morality, and it was about irresponsibility, and it was not an acknowledgement that people are ill. Even though we know from all the research, from all the studies that have been done, that this is an illness and it's a brain disease. The brains of people who are addicted process drugs and alcohol differently. Most people, or many people, try drugs more they use drugs. And they have a disease, and the disease is treatable. When I mentioned when the time that the media wants to talk about it, the country wants to talk about it, is when a celebrity overdoses. When Philip Seymour Hoffman died, Time Magazine called me up and asked me to write about his death, and I wrote about the treatment system that failed him. But in the very beginning, I said something about the fact that here was a man who had this disease and never got the treatment that he needed. And the reaction to the story just stunned me, because people weren't talking about the disease of addiction. They weren't talking about the treatment that he didn't receive. They were talking about it was this prejudice and anger and this callousness and this ignorance. Even a psychiatrist wrote a column who he said, no quirk of neurochemistry can make you rate getting high is more important than getting your kids through life. Only disorder of character can do that. So we're taking on very, very, very deep prejudices. It hits people on a very, very deep, visceral level. People, I think, are threatened by the fact that maybe sometimes people, we live in a culture that is all about willpower and it's all about we control our destinies. But sometimes we don't when we become ill. And it matters what people think. And the reason it matters is because we judge and punish people who make bad choices. And we demand confession and contrition. But on the contrary, when someone is ill, we treat them with compassion. And we know how to move forward. They need to be treated with the best options that we have available to them. That leads to the second part. I mean, there's a lot more about education. We have failed. We have failed in every way to educate kids about drugs, and it's because we do it in the exact wrong way. We assume once again that the drugs are about choice, about drug uses. We all know drugs are out there. It's really, really common for kids to, Nick says that he was out at the playground or whatever they call it in high school, at the field after school, and someone handed him a joint, and that happens to, if not most kids, well, about 80% of kids before they reach 18 will try something. And so we tell them to just say no. And it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because we don't acknowledge the reason that people use drugs in the first place. And until we acknowledge the reason people use drugs in the first place, we're going to continue to fail to address this problem, both of addiction and drug use overall, and addiction specifically. There are, again, I can talk a long time about all these and I won't, but there are risk factors that increase the likelihood dramatically that people will use drugs at first and will become addicted. And they include psychological disorders, neurological disorders. People who've experienced trauma is very common. Most people who become seriously addicted have experienced some sort of trauma, whether it's trauma in the family of sort of abuse, obvious abuse, violence, or even sort of much more subtle abuse, the kind of trauma that we don't necessarily see, but living in families that are, where there is this consistent low-grade stress and trauma. Genetics is a big, big part of addiction. Poverty, what comes along with poverty, poor health, poor nutrition. The general overview of all of this, what connects them all, is stress. There's a lot of research that says that stress causes addiction, and it makes sense. If people have these other problems, if people are living in poverty, if people have mental illnesses, if people have learning disorders, whatever it is, it increases stress. And it turns out that it's not just this idea that, that I'll come home after a day of a stressful day or something like that and I'll say I need a drink. And it does help. It makes stress go away a little bit. But it's not just that. It's not just stress. It turns out that the pathways in our brain related to stress are completely related to, in fact, there's in some cases connected to the stress, the pathways that are related to addiction. did lots of research laboratories and learned a lot about this. One of them that was pretty interesting was in San Francisco, and this was a researcher who did experiments with flies. And she researched flies, if any of you are probably in some studying some various sciences and medicine know that researchers use stress because they do have a lot of genetic comparison, even though it's hard to believe that flies have genetic similarities to us. And it turns out that one of the similarities is that flies will, if you give them alcohol or drugs, they will become addicted. And before they become addicted, they will act sort of like people do. So if you get flies high, they will sort of buzz around and they'll kind of bang into the walls. And eventually, if you give them enough drugs or alcohol, they will pass out and sort of go into a stupor and then recover, hungover, or whatever the fly equivalent would be. So a researcher that I met with would get flies addicted, and the reason she would do it, she would give them this cocaine mist or this alcohol food with alcohol in it. And at a certain point, she could addict flies, and especially she would identify certain flies that were more likely to become addicted anyway. She would get it to the point where she'd put them in this course, and in order to get to their drug, whether it was cocaine or alcohol, she trained them so they understood where they could get the drug. And eventually she got it so that these flies could go either two different pathways, and one of them they would get food, and the other one they would get food with their drug. And at a certain point, flies went for the drugs. At a certain point, the specific flies had been genetically engineered so that they were the ones who were the most susceptible to addiction, would always go to the drugs. And even when she put this metal plate on the bottom of this course that would shock them, the flies that were so-called not addicted, the flies would touch the metal course and they would feel the shock and they would not ever return there. The ones who were addicted would cross that metal, they would get shocked multiple times in order to get their drugs. So she understood this behavior, this drug-seeking behavior, and how powerful it was. And we can presume that that's not about peer pressure. These are people, these are drugs, there's a physical component that has nothing to do with emotion, has nothing to do with psychology. It's a physical addiction. And so then she wanted to test this idea about stress. And the way that she did that is she stressed the flies to see if it changed their drug-seeking behavior. And it did. And of course, I couldn't help asking her how she stresses out flies. And she said that she either puts them together in a really overcrowded environment, or she isolates them, or she heats them, or she puts them in a refrigerator, various ways. And one of the ways she said that she did it was that she suppresses courtship, which was basically what I learned when she explained what that means. And basically she means they sexually frustrates these flies. And the way that she does it is she takes these male flies and if you put them with virgin female flies, they will mate. But if the female flies are not virgin, they will attack the male vehemently and sometimes even to the point of killing them. And so she stressed out the flies, and lo and behold, they would go endure this metal plate. They would endure the metal plate, the electricity of the metal plate, even when the electric charge was turned up. And of course, maybe it won't surprise you that of all the ways that she stressed flies, the ones who were the most likely to seek out drugs were the sexually frustrated male flies. The reason that this is important is, of course, it has implications in treatment and in prevention. We have this idea that drug use is about, again, choice, and that we have this culture that treats kids, the kids who use drugs are the bad kids. Bad kids use drugs, good kids don't. But what this pediatrician said to me, these aren't bad kids, these are our kids. And so if we want to prevent their drug use, and if we want to prevent them from becoming addicted, we have to help them grow up as healthily as we can and as safely as we can. There are many ways that have been proven to help prevent drug use and prevent addiction. addiction. The main one, the overview of all this, is that since we know that addiction is that drug use is first, and then increased drug use, and then addiction is related to stress, then we want to do what we can to mitigate stress in kids' lives. And we can. And exactly the work that you're doing, the work you did this summer, and the work that hopefully you will continue doing, and I know many of you will, that's what it's all about. It's about helping kids grow up healthier, safer, helping them get whatever it is they need, the kinds of programs, the kinds of resources that they need, whether it's very, very sort of specific things about safe homes to live in with caretakers who are competent and can give them stability, or access to nutrition, exercise, school. That's how we're going to change this. And as long as we keep trying to change this by scolding kids, isolating them further by kicking them out of school, putting them in the criminal justice system, the more we're increasing stress in their lives, the more likely they're going to be using, and the more likely they're going to become addicted. And our problem is going to continue to rise. Whereas, if we treat this, there are so many diseases we know that it's all about prevention. And if you can treat prevention, if you can prevent diseases from either taking root in the first place or treat them and prevent them from progressing, we can, first of all, we can save lives. And second of all, one of the reasons that people judge addicts so harshly is because the behavior associated with addiction. Addicts do cause crimes. Addicts do cause violent crimes. They break into, my son, before it was over, he broke into our home many times. He was arrested. He did things that were unconscionable and baffling to me. This was a kid who I knew was a good kid and he had morals. And yet, if we can recognize addiction early and treat it early, then we can stop this disease from regressing to the point where addicts are in a situation where everything about their existence is about drug seeking, which is why addicts get to the point where they are committing these crimes. They are not functioning correctly. They are not thinking correctly. We want people to act rationally, but someone who's addicted isn't acting rationally because their brain isn't functioning correctly. Very, very quickly, I'll say that part of the reason we want to catch this early is because we don't want it to escalate, of course. The other reason we want to treat it early is because if it does escalate, the treatment system in this country is appalling. It is criminal. Any mental illness, we know mental illness care is lacking compared to other healthcare. I mean, all healthcare is challenging for many, many families. Mental illness is harder and addiction is harder still. So, even getting people in the door of a program, if you work with people with either people who are themselves addicted or people whose families are addicted, even to be able to find them any treatment program whatsoever is really, really hard. It's really challenging, and in some cases it's not even possible. But even if you do get them into a program, most of the treatment programs people worry, or people talk about this disease. This is a chronic illness, and people do relapse over this disease. Partly it's just like diabetes or something like that. It's a disease that must be treated. It's part of what it's the brain is different. It processes drugs differently. There often is, not always, but there often is requirements of treatment for a lifetime. And so people relapse. Part of relapse with cancer sometimes being the cancer comes back, and somebody in that situation needs more treatment. Relapse addiction can come back for that reason, but a lot of the reason people relapse, the reason that we have such relapse rates is because people are not getting treated in the way that they can, or they need to be. The first thing we do is we have this really archaic and primitive idea that addicts cannot be helped unless they hit bottom. any other disease, do we want to, actually Tom McClellan, who many of you know, he's a professor here, he's an extraordinary person. He says, it's like waiting for a diabetic to lose a leg before we put them into treatment. We want to get people into treatment with any disease as quickly as we can, the first signs. One of the things that we want to do, there was a survey of pediatricians in America that showed that about 6%, only 6% of them were able to identify drug problems in kids and their patients. And yet, pediatricians we're sending our kids to pediatricians because they're sort of the first line of defense. And of course, parents have to be educated, teachers have to be educated. So we want to get people into treatment as quickly as we can. And then the treatment program is appalling. It's an archaic system. Basically, it's all about blaming. There are programs that Nick was in where kids who didn't follow rules, didn't make his bed correctly, was late for a meeting or a therapy session or something like that, they were punished. They had to go out in the grass in the winter time and cut grass with scissors as a punishment, or sent to clean the tiles, the grout between the tiles in the bathroom with a toothbrush. Is that how we treat illness? We have this system that is all about making people feel worse about themselves, and it's all about contrition, and it's about prayer, and it's about, prayer is important for a lot of people, but it's not the way we treat illnesses. The treatment system is changing. Part of the reason it's changing is because we are learning more about the problem of addiction and learning about treatment. Again, right here in Philadelphia, I would say, I don't know if this is exactly right, but I would say there's probably more of the most advanced addiction treatment research going on here than any place else in the country or the world. Oftentimes when I'm referred to specialists, because I'm writing about addiction, some aspect of addiction, whether it's treatment or whether it's some of the more far-reaching technologies that are about treating addiction in the future, including things like vaccines and things like that are directed to Philadelphia, to the universities here. So we know a lot. There's a huge gap between what we know and getting it out to people who need it. But it's happening, and it's going to happen quicker now, at least in theory, because the Affordable Care Act is sort of miraculous. Yes, it's got problems that we hear about every day and maybe even experience about personally or in our work, but it's remarkable because, at least in theory, at least according to the regulations, according to the words on the page, for the first time ever, mental illness overall, including addiction care, companies are required to to cover it at the same rates as they cover in parity with other illnesses, which means that if a person does relapse over the course of, the insurance, if somebody needs, right now a lot of the programs that people are sent to are 28-day programs, as if that can treat this serious illness, which it can't. So if a doctor understands that this person needs to be in treatment for 6 months or even longer, in theory, insurance will pay for that. And then if they're discharged and they're doing well, but a year later there is a relapse, the insurance will continue. Right now it is, insurance overall, I'm sure, again, the people who work with people who require insurance understand how hard it is. And even with the Affordable Care Act, a lot of people aren't covered. And even people with the Affordable Care Act insurance, it's still really hard to navigate and get the coverage you need. Someone very quickly, I'll tell a joke, somebody told me that 3 people had died and they were at the pearly gates and they were meeting St. Peter, who was to decide if they were allowed to go into heaven or not. And the first one was a cardiologist, and St. Peter said, why should I allow you into heaven? And the cardiologist said, well, I've spent my life healing people with heart problems and I've saved so many lives. And St. Peter said, welcome to heaven. The next person was a social worker, and St. Peter once again, why? And she said, because I've helped families get the support they need, and welcome to heaven. And the third person, he said, why should you get into heaven? And this person said that he ran an HMO, and he said, why should you get into heaven? And St. Peter said, well, we've got health care for millions of people. And St. Peter said, well, there's some good news and some bad news. He said, you're welcome to come into heaven for 24 hours. The other reason that I'm hopeful, I guess there are two more that I'll say. And the first one is that because, unfortunately, tragedy often is what it takes to bring about change in our country. I talked about the fact that one person is dying every 20 minutes from an overdose of addiction, of opiates, of pain pills. It's unprecedented. So suddenly we have, a governor in a state devoting his entire State of the Union to addiction problem in his state. We have in Congress in Washington, we have hearings. We have in most states, there are special committees to deal with because this problem is so pervasive. And unfortunately, tragically, and again, this is maybe typical of our country, there were a lot of people dying of addiction before this problem. There was a crack epidemic not too long ago, but the crack epidemic was killing people in really poor neighborhoods, and mostly African Americans. We weren't talking about it. There were no hearings, very, very little conversation. But this epidemic is hitting, white middle-class families, and these parents their kids are dying, and these are parents that do have people. They have the ear of their legislators, and so they're making a difference, and they are going around the country. In Pennsylvania, this is happening. It's happening in other places, dealing with the problems with insurance, putting legislation into place, putting a lot of pressure on legislators to pass laws like there's something called the 911 law that a lot of kids have been dying recently who they're in a social situation, they're all getting high, and one kid will pass out and overdose, and nobody will call the police or call 911 because they're afraid that they're going to get in trouble, which they would. But many, many kids, if somebody responds to an opiate overdose very quickly, then most people can be saved. But they're not calling because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble. Well, this 911 law will prevent somebody who saves another life who calls. Anyway, they're rallying. There's going to be a big march on Washington. They're trying to model it after other diseases, where there are bike-a-thons. People who have to understand this is a disease will treat it like a disease. And there is, because of this movement, there's a grassroots movement that is having an impact. And it will continue to. And the other thing that I will say that's hopeful goes back to what I said at first, which is it's really because of you. It's because people are doing the work that we need more than anything else. And of course, it's not just to prevent addiction. It's to help, once again, it's to help our children grow up healthily and safely. The same risk factors that lead to addiction also lead to criminality, lead to kids to drop out of school, leads to a perpetuating cycle of poverty. All of those become risk factors for addiction, and they all increase. It's no surprise that people in a family where people become addicted, they're not functioning properly, and so they're not as able to take care of their children if their parents not as able to work. So all these programs, all these problems are inseparable, and they all make one another worse. It's exponential. So the work that you're doing, if people like you all over the country, means that there really is hope. And so I will end there just by saying thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, David. And for those of you who want a book sign or want to buy a book, we're actually going to put David over here. And for those of you who want to talk to David, I would appreciate if students would go downstairs first and then come back up. And I also want to end by thanking the students You are our future, you're our hope, and we hope that you will continue to stay in touch with us and continue the good work that you did this summer. Thank you very much.
You go shopping today? No, it's just a gift for the gift. I didn't look at
Yeah, it should. I mean, there might be. We've had a couple of classes. It's not very
Rocket take down. No, I broke.